Well, welcome, guys. It's 4:01, so we'll get things started here. So I want to say hello again and welcome everyone to what is now our second talk of our winter lecture series. Again, this is a new program series for us here at the DuPont Nature Center. We're excited to take this opportunity in the wintertime when things slow down for us to be able to bring other interest in programming that isn't always us in the front. Even though we love doing it, what we really wanted to do was bring out some other people that we work with, especially in the Division of Fish and Wildlife, and have you guys learn about what they're doing because they're doing some amazing projects up and down the state that a lot of people don't know is going on or don't get the chance to learn about it. So that's really what we wanted to do with this series is get the chance to connect our visitors with these other great people that we work with throughout the year. So during tonight's topic, as well as the next couple weeks, we'll be covering a few different topics concerning the work of that some of our people in Fish and Wildlife are doing to further showcase all the efforts statewide that we put into managing and conserving the environment that you find in our first state. Before we start the program, again, first of all, thanks for joining us. For y'all who are here, if you have any questions, ask away. For those of you who are joining us online, if you have questions, please write them in the chat and we'll answer them at the end of our program today. Again, for those of you here, if you need to use the bathroom or anything, they're located right behind the wall there. Otherwise, if you need anything, just let me or one of my staff members know. So today we are joined by Kat Christie, a coastal waterbird biologist with DNREC's Division of Fish and Wildlife. We're really excited for her to be here because every year, especially in the spring, almost everyone who visits us here at the DuPont Nature Center says, who are those people out in the marsh? Who are those people on the beach? What are they doing out there? How'd they get out there? What do you mean they're studying birds? What does that mean? Well, Kat here is one of those people. In fact, she helps run that project out there. And so we figured she would be the perfect person to tell you everything you might want to know about that and hopefully answer all of your questions about the incredible research they do and the management projects that take place literally right outside of our window on the shore, but as well throughout the Delaware Bay. So with that being said, I'm going to let Kat talk to you about what her team does, why it's so important, and hopefully answer anything that comes to your mind about who those people are in the marsh and what exactly are they doing. All right.
Hi, I'm one of the marsh people. As you can see, I've included this picture here to feature we literally work right here. The majority of our work is taking place in the harbor out here. That red roof building is where we're sitting. It's all happening right here. If you want to see us out there, come back anytime in May, and there'll be a whole host of people running back and forth in boats or kind of crouching strangely against the rock walls. And we're getting a whole lot of bird work done. So I'm here to talk about that specific project, not so much the ecology of the birds. That, if you read any of these wall displays, there's so much information here about kind of what those birds are up to and what they're doing. I kind of want to summarize what we get up to here on the beaches.
I'm a little bit tall.
Thanks. I'm like trying to make eye contact. So what is the Delaware Shorebird Project? It is kind of a partnership of a bunch of local, regional, and international partners and volunteers that come together every May. It's headed up by me and other biologists at Delaware Division of Fish and Wildlife, as well as other DNREC partners, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, U.S. Geological Survey, and then the U.K.'s Wash Wader Research Group, which is a shorebird research organization in the U.K. That's been doing this work for even longer than we have. So why are all of these initials and acronyms gathering in Delaware? This is kind of a snapshot from Audubon's Bird Migration Explorer that is showing tracks from publicly available GPS tagged birds filtered to only shorebirds, which unfortunately they've happened to make the least legible color. I'm sorry. But if you squint really hard, you can see a dense clump in the spaghetti pile here. And if you zoom in, you'll see it is right here. This is where so many birds are hanging out. Specifically, you'll see on this side, New Jersey and Cape May, and then literally right where we are is kind of an epicenter of a lot of these GPS points. Part of that, I have to admit, is because we put a lot of tags out on birds here, but we put the tags on the birds because we have so many that we're available to see, and so many of them from other regions do come to this area. You might also have clocked that a lot of these migration paths seem to go the entire length of the globe, and I would say great spotting. Our most famous migrant that we get is the roofer redknot, and those guys are well known for wintering on the far southern tip of South America and spending their breeding season deep into the Canadian Arctic. So it's a really incredible marathon migration they're completing every year. And they can't quite make it all in one shot. They do go remarkably fast, seeing as we're talking about birds that are well under half a pound at their heaviest. But they tend to make a really long first flight and then stop here to fuel up, gain more fat, more energy, and make the rest of that trip up into the breeding grounds. So we are the single most important stopover location during northbound migration for the red knot. We knew that was going to happen. Um, and many other shorebird species also really rely on what we've got here. Do any locals have any guesses as to why Delaware is that stopover? You may have heard about this before. Horseshoe crabs! For the uninitiated into the Delaware cult of the horseshoe crab, um, we have an internationally known horseshoe crab spawning event that occurs in Delaware every late spring, early summer, where huge amounts of horseshoe crabs come into the bay, go up onto these sheltered bay beaches to lay their eggs. It's absolutely massive, and it's occurring at such insane numbers and density of eggs that it has actually shaped the evolution of multiple species so that they time their migration to match this horseshoe crab spawning event. Um, Horseshoe crab eggs, when you're talking about birds that are trying to make that huge migration flight, horseshoe crab eggs don't have shells. They do not run away from you. They're super easily turned into energy and fat, and it's an incredibly valuable energy source for these birds as they're making that trip. Some of them, like the red knot, rely so heavily on the horseshoe crab eggs that actually their digestion and metabolism change during this period of the year to prioritize digesting those horseshoe crab eggs, and they can't actually utilize other food sources as effectively as they normally could. So it is truly like such a strong biological connection between these birds and these horseshoe crab eggs in this harbor and this bay. Now, whenever you talk about a super tightly timed, beautiful natural system that works together in close proximity, and then you introduce humans to the area, you're going to end with population crash at some point. So ours happened due to huge increases in harvest of horseshoe crabs during 80s, 90s, 2000s, and corresponding major declines in the birds that we were observing here, primarily the red knot, because as I mentioned, those are the ones most tightly associated with horseshoe crab populations that have the least flexibility with other food sources and other locations. So state biologists in Delaware and in New Jersey had already kind of started paying attention and doing these surveys by the late 80s, and then were able to document this major population change as we were seeing them come through the bay. And we were able to raise that first alarm bell that there was something massively wrong, and here it was fairly easy to pinpoint what that thing was. So the efforts that we did here in the bay on both sides kind of jump-started this movement for shorebird conservation that at this point has spread across the globe. It's a very interconnected, very international series of partnerships from as far south as these birds go to as far north, and we all kind of work together to monitor these birds because they are crossing those boundaries. To the birds, none of that makes any difference. That's their range, and we all kind of have to work together within the range, but all that effort started here in the Delaware Bay. So that introduces us to the Delaware Shorebird Project and it forming. So the first partnerships in Delaware were between our state biologist, Dave Carter, who started doing a bunch of these surveys in 1989-ish, and he partnered with Nigel Clark, an ornithologist from the UK, who was doing similar work as his graduate projects in the UK, studying a similar stopover location there called the Wash, where a bunch of birds that are similar to our birds come through on their southbound migration in the fall. So he pioneered all these capture techniques, and he was learning how to individually mark them and figuring out what worked and what didn't. And we physically brought him here, and he still comes every single year. Dave Carter still involved every single year. We've got these long-lasting partnerships with people who have really pioneered a lot of this work, and it's been happening through intense collaboration across different nations for decades at this point. So I've included kind of a schematic of different work that we do. All the things that we do are kind of interconnected. They're not, we do surveys and then we do banding, and then like all these things kind of work together. And really the key is that we need to take advantage of this incredible opportunity we've got while these very wide-ranging species are all concentrated into a small area at like a set time every year. That just simply doesn't happen. If you're thinking about trying to monitor them anywhere else, you would be trying to monitor the entire Canadian Arctic for a bunch of disparate nesting sites. Whereas when we've got them here, they are essentially clustered around this bay shore, and we know when and we know where they're going to be, and we can collect so much data there that is really valuable for making larger decisions. the other key component of that is being consistent across years. We want to be able to compare apples to apples every year and see long-term trends. We can't just be changing our techniques, changing our methods, shifting around a lot. We have to do that very carefully. We want to keep up with the times, but we want to also be able to truly compare these changes long-term. So kind of one of the most basic components of our work are coastwide surveys, which is just counting flocks. A lot of our work relies on banding and flagging, so giving unique identifiers to each of these birds that we're then able to track year over year and pull out individual trends there. While we're banding the birds, and then later, once they have that unique identifier, we're able to collect a lot of metrics on them, things like weight or bill length and other measurements, as well as that observational data from the recited flag that we're able to see year after year. And we also, when we have birds in hand, as we say, can attach geolocators to them, things like satellite tags or MODIS tags that we're then able to contribute to movement studies. When we multiply those individual metrics over all the hundreds and thousands of birds that we see or handle each year, we then can start making big kind of population level implications with what we're learning here, things like relative weight across seasons, survivorship rates, migration timing, and things like that that really do have a large impact on our understanding of these species and help understand where we need to direct our efforts worldwide, as well as right here. So these conversations after seasons end up happening with, local and regional biologists and horseshoe crab management people, as well as, this information that we gather here affects decisions made throughout the entire hemisphere because we kind of have one of the most concentrated abilities to learn about these birds. Here's a little look at our survey map. So this is showing kind of the Delaware side of the bay, and we tend to do surveys from about Port Mahon down to Prime Hook. So if you're out on those beaches in May and you see people like lugging really heavy scopes down the beach, they're probably with us. We're out each of these sites at least once every 3 days throughout migration. And then we complete about 2 aerial surveys by plane each year in conjunction with New Jersey State. Usually have, at this point, 1 biologist from each state goes out there, and we circle the entire bay all at once and kind of count every bird that is there on that day. We focus on 4 focal species, which are red knot, ruddy turnstone, sanderling, and semi-palmated sandpiper. I'll show you a picture up there in a minute to point them out in case you've seen them before. And while we're out there doing these surveys, we do these flock counts, but we also collect more data like those individual recites of the leg flags, as well as ratios of marked to unmarked birds. And so while we're out there, we're getting as much data out of this as we can, which is kind of the mantra here, is just get as much as possible. And that marked to unmarked ratio ends up going into our larger population analysis that biologists at USGS complete to understand kind of what the overall population numbers are relative to how many marked birds we're seeing. So if you think about the fraction there, if we know in a general flock on average, we have a certain amount of marked birds, certain amount of unmarked birds, and we know how many flags we put out, through a little bit of a complicated math, it's not exactly just cross multiplying, you can start to figure out how many birds were in our population to begin with. Here's a look at our focal species, just to point them out. We've got the handsome ruddy turnstone on the far side here with that really bold black and white head and reddish brown body. And then the star of the show is the red knot in the middle here with that kind of checkered black and white back and all red underside. And he's one of the bigger guys that we see out there. Then the next 2, you may notice, look almost exactly the same. Real challenge when you're looking at flocks from a distance. There is a huge size difference in them. You can kind of see from those 2 is that one's about half the size, but markings wise, they're pretty similar. Smaller one is the semi-palmated sandpiper, larger is the sanderling. And we collect data on,
And the sandpiper, they're the ones I see every morning at Summit.
Yep, there's a lot. Yeah, these guys, especially the sanderling, we have year round. Yep. Yeah, they're usually not too scared. They're not shy. We collect data on, those are our focus species, but we collect data on pretty much any shorebird species that's out there. So I just pointed out, 2 stragglers. This is a short-billed dowager, and that's a dunlin over in the corner. We count gulls, we count everything. Again, get as much out of this as possible. We've got people doing tons of surveys. We might as well make the most of it. And again, I said surveys were kind of the simplest part of our work, but as you can start to see from that bird ID, maybe it's still not so simple. This is just a kind of a picture of a portion of a flock. And if you were walking down a whole beach and you were dealing with this, how would you even start to guess how many birds were here? This picture has some red knot in the back, a couple dunlin over there, Mostly it's ruddy turnstone, and maybe just think, what's your gut for how many ruddy turnstone there are here? Kind of how we deal with this is we start to create groupings. So you kind of learn what a group, yep, exactly. Here I would do group of 10. So I would say this is probably about 10 birds and counting that over. 70 is what I got when I grouped. And when I counted, it was 65. So we're hiring you. Yeah, some people, once you get those big flocks, people learn kind of what a group of 100 or 200 or 500 looks like. And you're doing this from a long distance with sun glare, with bird movement, and you're having to count at least those 4 species, usually more. It's complicated. Our volunteers go through a lot of training to understand how to standardize those counts, and it's always going to be an estimate. We don't pretend that, if someone sees 100 less birds one day, that 100 birds are missing from the population. It's an estimate, but, we average it all together, and there's a good amount of truth in it. Then, next component of our work, besides surveys, is banding and flagging, and that's really kind of determines a lot of else of what we get out of this. We use a technique called cannon netting that allows us to catch huge amounts of birds all at once in these flocks, which you really need to do if you're going to be getting any kind of significant percentage of shorebird populations banded, because there's a ton of them. Even when we say a shorebird population is crashing, it's a big population of birds that you're coming from. We just want to get it back to those historic levels. So we tend to cannon net anywhere between 5 and 10 times a season, and the goal is to apply these field-readable bands, which I'll pass around so you can get a look at them. These are not going on birds, so because they're duplicates, so feel free to poke them, look at them. So we apply those bands, those flags that are plastic and have a 3-digit unique code on them, as well as USGS metal bands, which have a number, like forgetting how many digits, and I'm not going to guess, number that is unique to the birds. And those you can read if you're holding the bird, but the key with the flags is you don't have to be holding the bird to read that. And so I'm going to try to play a video that shows a cannon net catch in a second, but depending on if it works. And also I just kind of want to talk you through the process because it can be still hard to tell what's going on from a video. So in these photos, you can see our friend Emma on the left is carrying our 2 cannons. So these cannons, and again, there's our building right here. We're always here. These cannons get buried under the sand with that heavy end down and pointed up and out, which is critical because they are cannons. Those get buried and attached to this nicely furled up net here. A group is watching the area that we're trying to trap in, and when the birds gather, if the birds gather, someone says fire, and those things go, and the cannons pull the front of the net up and out over a flock, and then they settle over the birds. I said if the birds gather. We try to scout areas where birds are gathering, within a couple hours or a day before. It's usually something like, oh, there's good eggs in this one spot, and as the tide comes up, the birds get pushed to this level, and I left a marker there. Like, we're trying to kind of predict where birds will be standing. So sometimes it works, a lot of times it doesn't. Either conditions don't match and it's too windy, or there's too many boats going by, or the birds just don't sit in the same spot again.
The width of the net and the length of how much
Oh.
ground are you covering with material?
That's a very specific question that I don't know the answer to, but I don't know, kind of get a scale for these guys.
Yeah.
Someone in the chat can probably help me out here, but yeah, I would say like 15 meters. No, that's probably too long. I don't know. The people who set up the net know really well how long it is and exactly where it's going to land. I help. That's why we bring our British team in. This is their show, really, as far as the netting goes. We all know what we're doing and know how to help, but that's kind of the hugest contribution that they make, is they are pros in this cannon netting. They do it year round in the wash. We just do it when they're here to help us. So we try to get that done. When it works great. We had a catch this year where we banded almost 600 birds in under 3 hours. Like, huge numbers that we can get when this goes well. Other times you just go home and it's, a long day and it's frustrating, but it's fine. When and if that net does fire and you've now got a net over a whole flock of birds, everyone runs like crazy as fast as they can, which might not be that fast if you're in sand or mud. It just feels really fast. And kind of covers they gather and check that the net is secured and there's not, a big, something holding it up and all the birds are flying out the side. Everyone kind of takes a second to get situated. A group will cover the net with a light covered cloth so that the birds are in the dark, a little calmer, blocked from the sun, kind of takes the rush out of everything. And then the group that knows what they're doing kind of goes up to the front and starts pulling birds out one by one. And we work systematically up the net, pulling the birds out and putting them into these little boxes here that we're able to then quickly carry, a couple birds at a time into a shaded area we've already set up. And we've got these whole tall runs that they're able to be on sand, fully extend, run around comfortably for what the duration of the time to try to minimize the stress as much as we can. And then we keep those catches to about an under 3-hour limit before we have to be done and out, and we just don't overcommit. So a lot of times if we catch more birds than we know we have the people for, they get released at the net. We don't try to keep birds that we're not going to be working with directly. Now I'm going to cause real chaos and try to get a video up, and it's not going to go well, guys. I'm just going to say that now. Let's see what happens. What happens if I do this? Okay, so far so good, everyone. So this is going to be just a video from the nature camera here that's showing our group here waiting for the net to fire. The net is around here. I don't know how well you'll be able to see that. These are our kind of designated watchers. I think I'm one of them. I don't remember. Our designated watchers who are watching that net area, keeping track of how many birds are in the catch area, making sure that none of them are in a dangerous position, because then we obviously won't fire the net. We've got a second sneaky scout over here getting a nice side view. Okay. Net fires, goes over the birds. Everyone panics. Sometimes we get warning. I think this was one of those days where we didn't, and you've just been sitting there for a couple hours and suddenly you hear a cannon go off. Whole crowd grabbing their boxes, grabbing their cover cloth. Everything's happening all at once. And then we run out to the net and kind of do that process of getting everything situated. Because everyone, spreading out, figuring out, the best places to be, checking all the borders while the people who are doing the cloth kind of get that figured out. And then they cover it up and we can start the rest of the process. Maybe. Okay, now I just have to figure out how to get it all back, but bear with me. Set. What did I do last time? Oh no, I'm in the wrong thing. Okay, I got it now, I think. I will hit the button. Maybe it will work. Well, it worked. Shocks. Crazy. Okay, well that was that. That was the biggest holdup, and we got through it, guys, so this is great. Okay, here's a better look at so you guys got to see those physical flags. Here's what they look like on birds. So you can see they're readable. They're not huge. They're not obviously readable necessarily. We need pretty good cameras and scopes to be able to see this, and it's still a challenge. This is a picture with one flagged red knot right in the middle. So you can see kind of with less zoom, you're not going to be reading that. You can see that there's something on its leg, but that's about it. So we spend a lot of time out on these rock walls, out on beaches, just very quietly sitting and waiting for kind of flocks to gather in front of us to minimize disturbance as much as possible, because you're way more likely to see these birds' leg flags if they're not jumping up and flying all the time. So we spend a lot of time and patience and energy sitting there and awaiting, scoping through flocks to get these identifications. Each species, flag color, and then 3-digit code is unique to a bird. So you could have a different red knot with that code. You could have a ready turnstone like this guy is, but with a dark green 2 equals you, and that's a different bird. And you just have to be good at recognizing those colors, good at reading those characters, and good at your species ID to be able to get those.
All species, like the ready turnstones always been on the left leg and the knots on the right, or?
No, there's not too much of a system with the right left for these guys. I think that might be wrong, but sorry. That I think there is a system, and that it just, I think Yeah, it goes back and forth a little bit. I think it's different for each species. I think you're right in that it's different for each species. I'm usually not head bander, I'm head people manager. So, um,
Yeah, I've seen royal terns here. with
yes,
bands on them,
yes.
And not always when I see them, and I can read the numbers real easy, and I give them to Patrick to check them out, I see they're always on the same leg. And then I
Yep.
see other birds on the other leg, so I just wonder.
Yeah, I think different banding projects and
before-
different species each
Yeah,
have their
okay.
systems. We don't band royal terns in Delaware, but yeah, we see a ton of them and we report those bands because
Okay.
we get them especially during the summer and the late summer during migration after they finish breeding. Yeah, so we spend so much time out there. We get a bunch of these flags. We get thousands of resites a year, and so that really adds up into what we're able to collect from this. Also, in the process of that banding, in addition to just getting the bands on the birds, we're able to get a lot of information out of that. Things like morphology, which is weight, bill length, wing length, a bunch of different metrics that we can just get on the birds while we have them in hand. It's also a great opportunity to apply geolocators, satellite tags, things like that, if we have an ongoing project with that. And then one of the most critical and kind of high value things we're able to do here relates to feather isotopes. So from all our red knot, we collect one feather that's on a covert feather, so it's not critical for their flight or anything. And we process that. I just finished processing this year's samples finally. And we send that off, and they are able to determine from the chemical composition of the isotopes in the feather where that feather was grown, which AKA where the bird spent the winter. And that's huge when we're talking about these birds that have such a wide range, because there can be really complex facets to the population trends. There could be great recruitment, great survival from birds that winter in Argentina, but the populations in Brazil could be tanking. And to us, that might look like a pretty average year overall. But if you're then able to go after the fact and say, actually, 80% of our birds this year were from Argentina and only 20% from Brazil, and that's not the ratio we're normally seeing, we can kind of start to figure more of that out. That's less necessary now because there's now more projects and more conservation efforts all the way through the range, but it's still good to have during our really concentrated period of data collection for these species to have evidence of, kind of what's going on range wide that can then support observations that people have on the ground and kind of establish those more complex patterns. Because these species have complex ranges, complex annual cycles, none of it's simple, and we're trying to get as close to the truth of what's actually happening as possible with this limited time period that we have here. And then our observational data that we're able to get from unique flag IDs are things like site fidelity. How often are they coming to the bay? Do they skip the bay some years? Do they always arrive at the same time? How long do they live? And any patterns like that that we're then able to get by just seeing these same birds for years and years. And I've already touched a little bit on how some of those kind of individual metrics can then have big population level implications, but here's just a couple of figures that we generate within a season. So kind of one of the most useful is on the far side there with the relative weights. We've caught so many birds overall now at this point in the project that we're able to look at a specific day in May. Okay, how heavy were ruddy turnstone on May 30th, every other year that we caught ruddy turnstone on May 30th, how heavy were they when we caught them this year? You can see that in general, the weights go up throughout a season because the birds are coming here to fatten up. If the weights were going down, something would be dramatically wrong. But we can kind of see how well we're doing relative to past seasons, with the black here on the graph being this past year, and the orange is the average. And you can see overall on every catch that we kind of caught a significant amount of ruddy turnstone, it was an above average year for their weight relative to previous seasons. And the ones where it's low, I think we had like 10 turnstone in that catch. So we know not to necessarily, freak out based on single results. You have to look at it in the context of what was going on there. That middle figure is showing flock counts at a specific site. I believe this is at Fowler Beach specifically. And we can just look at things like this. Those different colored lines are different species, and you see that different species seem to kind of peak at different points of the season. They prioritize different sites at different points in the season. And just seeing things like that can help us parse out what's going on at these sites, why, if there's human disturbance reasons or migration timing reasons, and kind of add all of that together over the years. And then migratory connectivity is something that we're kind of really easily able to see because the flag colors correspond to where the bird was banded. So US flags are dark green like the ones there and light green, which I didn't include here because it would be thousands and it would really mess up the ability to see the other colors on the graph. But birds that we saw last year that were not banded in the US right away, if you see a blue flagged sanderling, you know that sanderling spends some time in Brazil. And that was kind of one of the Delaware Shorebird Project's first big contributions to understanding these birds was as we were putting all our green flags out, people were able to say, oh, like it comes back to Argentina. Oh, it comes back to Brazil. Oh, this is where it's breeding. Is we were kind of able to be some of the first people to establish those connections between sites and confirm just how many birds do funnel through this area and then spread out everywhere. It isn't just one subpopulation that uses the bay. The next big and probably our kind of most major population level analysis that we complete is completed by USGS partners, and it is our passage population analysis, which is what we use to kind of help make regional decisions related to horseshoe crabs and kind of track shorebirds in a more systematic way. Because you have to think of it, I put this little funnel graphic here as an idea is birds are coming from all over the world. Some of them are coming from as far as Argentina, some of them are coming from as close as Florida. They're arriving at different times and at different rates in the bay, and they're actively leaving as the season goes on. So no single survey, even that really nice aerial count where we count everything at once, no single survey is going to give you the full picture of everything that came into the funnel in the first place. So to do that, we kind of use our flagged birds as if we're picturing rice coming into the funnel, they're like neon painted rice. We track what they're doing and a bunch of other metrics to kind of see when did birds arrive? How long did they stay here and when did it leave? And when you're counting that times, a couple hundred or a couple thousand flagged birds that you were able to get really detailed information for, using a couple other big math things that, again, not my job, but someone's really great at it, you're able to make really big population level estimates of how many birds were here in the first place. And typically in the last few years, that number hovers around 40,000 for how many red knot specifically come into the bay. And we only do that big analysis for red knot because they are the most sensitive. So it's kind of like we pay a lot of attention to the most sensitive species, and we kind of assume that a lot of the others are following that trend. And then we also have survey data on them to back that up. That's kind of it. That's the crash course on the Delaware Shorebird Project. It's hard to express how cool this project is when maybe if you're from Delaware, it's kind of something you've been hearing about a little bit your whole life. But a good kind of advertisement for it is the people that come here every year. There's a team of anywhere from 5 to 15 British ornithologists who spend their personal vacation time here every year to work on this project. And we get people from Argentina, Australia, people who pay a huge amount of money and a bunch of effort to come here just to be part of this, as well as people from across the US that come every year or come as a special treat for themselves. And it is a huge volunteer team of usually about 40 people per year that all come here to be part of it, see what's going on, help us collect the data. And it's been going on for decades at this point. We take this information that we get here like to international conferences, and things that we do here in this project affect kind of hemisphere-wide management decisions. And it's a big source of like home state pride for a lot of people. And then at the same time, a lot of people have never heard of what's going on here. So just by coming and learning more details, you're already kind of contributing to being able to share this information and teach people what's going on our beaches, because it can be hard to know in the middle of the season why all of a sudden there's just a million birds and then they're all gone 2 weeks later and it's like you hallucinated them. And I guess the takeaway message of what can you do besides learning more, sharing that information. One of the things that can make our beaches more functional for this purpose that the red knot and other shorebird species rely on them is minimizing their disturbance as much as possible. We don't close a lot of our beaches, but things like walking around flocks if they're all foraging, or leashing dogs when they're around flocks, and if there's signs saying an area is closed or no dogs or only leash dogs, like trying to notice that signage and follow the guidelines there, just because so much energy can be wasted by these birds if they're having to constantly fly up into the air, find a new spot, fly up into the air, find a new spot. And when the main purpose of why they're here is to try to gain as much energy as possible, they're essentially trying to just sit down at the buffet and not get up again until it's time to fly all the way to the Arctic. We get asked a lot about flipping horseshoe crabs, which can be a great thing to do to get those horseshoe crabs back upright and able to go forward. If they're in the middle of a foraging flock, my personal recommendation would be to maybe leave him for a second, let the birds around it forage, because usually If they're surrounded by, a foraging flock, that means there's a lot of eggs there, which means it's probably relatively close to where the water will be able to wash that crab back in again. The crabs just aren't very good at staying upright, apparently. And that's kind of part of this whole interacting system that's working together and has for a very long time. We have volunteer opportunities with our project. We're sometimes limited with how many new people we can take each year just because it's such a fast-paced season. And we limited sometimes with our training opportunities, but we always want to put more people on the interest list and take as many new people as we can. There's other projects that involve volunteer work, like nighttime horseshoe crab spawning surveys, as well as another project I work on related to our beach nesting birds, where we have volunteers who kind of monitor those closed areas. And that has huge benefits for migrating birds as well as our beach nesters, because migrating birds like that same environment, and it just provides them uninterrupted beach during their stopover period, as well as protecting it for the local birds that do set up nests here. Delaware's coasts are really awesome. It's great that you're interested and wanting to know more. Come back here in May when you're seeing thousands and thousands of birds and all of our cool people boating around back there. Yeah, and it's great that everybody wants to know more and do more, and thanks for coming. That's all I got.
I have a question. I used to have a mission permit, and I would ban pasture meat,
Mhm.
sparrows, titmice, bugs. What's the oldest living right now? 3 years, 4 years?
Oh, teens.
Teens?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I forget his exact age. Again, some of these things happened right before I got here, but there was a new longest found bird. Yeah, more than 10 for red knot,
Okay.
for sure.
Okay.
And it's amazing seeing is that you'd think with that kind of life history where they're making that enormous journey every year, they wouldn't be very long-lived birds, but they are. Like they have a pretty long lifespan. They're just very athletic, very interesting species that we want to keep around. Yeah, they're gorgeous. This here is a sanderling and it's breeding colors, so that's just those boring gray and white birds you see all year, but suddenly in the summer it becomes beautiful.
And just for people who don't know, I come over it quite often. I don't live very far. But blackneck stills,
Yep.
oyster catchers, all a plethora of beautiful.
Yeah,
birds.
we've got amazing stuff here.
Yeah,
It's awesome.
Yeah, great.
Great. Any more questions from the people in the front?
Do they feed, are they nocturnal feeders also, or just in the daytime?
No, more daytime and kind of dusk dawn. The moon cycles have a lot to do with horseshoe crab spawning, so sometimes it's, related to
do
that.
they
It can
reach?
peak. Marshes typically is what we understand. Some of that is hard to tell because it's usually not areas that we can find them very well. So that's helpful. Some of our tagging studies recently have found that at least a lot of the ruddy turnstone that we tagged last year were roosting on like offshore break walls down by the Cape, and things like that. So pretty much anywhere that they can try to be safe from foxes and other predators, especially the human associated ones. Yeah. Yeah, foxes and then birds of prey. These guys are small enough that things like peregrines and that are a real threat. There's a few that set up shop around the harbor every year because that's just how nature works. But you know. Cool.
Thank you.
Have there been reports of any with the avian flu?
It's a hard question actually because Delaware Bay is kind of known in the avian flu community as being a weirdly high prevalence all the time, not just during a HPAI outbreak. So I'm not a flu expert. I'm not gonna, so don't listen to the flu experts on this, but relatively high prevalence in red knot and ruddy turnstone every year here. It doesn't seem to cause massive mortalities in them, at least at the levels that it's normally present. Because we don't have a lot of them here right now, I'm not super up on if they're having big mortality in their current wintering locations. But my hope is that since it is something that circulates in their populations relatively regularly, that maybe it's not as highly pathogenic in them. But if it is, we've had years where we've had to massively adjust our protocol to try to minimize any spread, things like that. Because again, no matter what, it's usually high prevalence here because these birds come in such densities and they're usually arriving in a pretty weakened state. So that makes it even easier for them to transmit viruses. So it's definitely something we're paying attention to. As far as the two most vulnerable and the ones that have had the most study, it's fairly common in them usually during this time of year. And the current virus that's circulating seems here to be mostly circulating in geese and things like that. And those are two very different species, one would hope that it's not super as easily transmissible between those groups. Yeah, I know her name and I've probably met her, but I'm terrible with names. So I think so. Yeah, I was at a big conference, kind of the big international Western Hemisphere conference last year, and she was there. And her name, I could be that her name just comes up because she's on all the papers, but yes.
We also have a question asking about the status of poultry population and the control.
Yeah, a lot of management now goes on with those, and it's kind of a actively being modified system where we're trying to come up with better and better models to try to figure out what's going on out there. But yes, a ton of people are doing trawling surveys and other kinds of surveys to kind of monitor the populations and all the different demographic measurements. And there's a big partnership committee essentially every year that gets together with the shorebird numbers, with the horseshoe crab numbers, and figures out what to do based on the models that we have that are, scientifically supported and have been tested through all these different simulations. So yes, people are paying a lot more attention to horseshoe crab numbers than they were at the time that populations were crashing. And it's good to know kind of where to focus our effort, because at one time maybe it was a very point source, the house is on fire problem that red knot were having. Shorebirds are still declining worldwide. And even if horseshoe crab numbers are fairly stable, we're still seeing that. So it's kind of interesting to start to figure out where else we need to be looking and what we need to be paying attention to, while always keeping an eye on that horseshoe crab level because the birds rely on it so heavily.
Thing that I think, that I've noticed that has improved the population, this entire beach area has been improved by building more beach.
Yep.
Years ago, I'd come here and these beaches were not even present.
Yeah.
Now they are. So there's more room for the crabs, more room for the birds, and
Yeah, there's a lot of habitat management
Yeah.
that goes on specifically with these birds in mind to give
Yeah.
more room for that horseshoe crab
'Cause I see-
spawning.
you're banding over here, and
Mhm.
you could sit here, and you could see hundreds of red dots right at that beach right
Yep.
here.
Yeah, they're usually on the side of the harbor that we're not.
Yeah.
It's kind of that's kind of what they like. Yeah, there's a lot of habitat management that's ongoing in this harbor and other places to
Yeah.
keep those beaches available, because the crabs prefer a certain grade of sand and a certain grade in the land, and it's all very particular. Cool. Anything else?
One more question.
One more question.
We had a question about our populations in our decrease area.
Yeah, it's relatively stable, the numbers that we get from that red knot report from year to year. It varies up and down a little bit, but it seemed mostly stable. Worldwide, not so much. So we can assume that overall, a lot of these species are not doing great. In our area, things seem to have kind of stabilized a bit, but again, that's kind of why we are out here every year, keeping close track of that information, because there is definitely downward trends still worldwide, and this work is still definitely very necessary. I would say in this area, kind of defined by like slow decline. It's not massive precipitous declines at this point anymore. But we would still like to see the populations higher than they currently are, for sure.
Of course, on this side, you're working on the red knots. On the New Jersey side, on the Delaware Bay, are they doing the same program at the
Yep,
same time?
Yep, there's a sister program in New
Okay.
Jersey that's doing very similar work to what we're doing here. And at least in recent years, they've had more of the red knot spending time on that side of the bay.
That's
And a lot of
great.
our work, we get red knot, we do what we can with them. We've kind of started to diversify even more and spend more time on these other shorebird projects, since that's kind of what we've got right now. So we did a lot of ready turnstone projects last year. Sometimes we get a great sanderling year like last year and try to get as much information about those species as possible. But yeah, we're constantly working with New Jersey State and their NGOs that do some of these projects over there.
Thank you.
It's a whole lot of collaboration, a whole lot of meetings, and then all chaos breaks loose in May and we all don't talk to each other again until the birds are gone, because it's completely chaos. The first time I talked here was right after the field season when Patrick invited me, and I showed up, no presentation, no nothing, just kind of spouted a bunch of information, went home, went to bed, and that was all I could manage. So you're getting the better version today. Great. Cool.
Well, I have one question for you.
hmm
How did you get involved in this line of work?
Ooh, I was always a nature person, became a bird person in college, and was doing a lot of work in Florida with wading birds and things like that. Kind of learned some of those boat and water bird work skills that you need. And then got lucky and got roped into this position, come up to Delaware, and the red knot migration is world famous. Who could say no? So I came here in July 2023. So last year was my first full field season here. And I'm planning to stick around. I'm a big animal fan, love the science, and this is definitely the place to be for bird conservation and bird biology. Thanks. Sweet.
Thank you.
Thanks.
You're here to say a couple final things. All right. Oh, yes.
These are turnstone flags, by the way.
They're a little smaller than not like.
I want to say thank you everyone for joining us both in here and online. Thank you again, Kat, for joining us. If you want to find out anything else about it, kind of keep up with it, we as well have a website for DNREC, the Delaware Shorebird Project. You just Google that and you'll see the website with a lot of the fantastic information she just shared and awesome more information that you can find out. Join us again next week, next Thursday at 4 o'clock as well. We'll be joined by another fish and wildlife expert to give a tick talk and talk about all of those pesky little ticks that we find around Delaware, but not only the bad things about them, but also how to keep yourself safe about them and learn tips and tricks on how to keep yourself safe, what to identify and when to know if you should maybe go see a medical professional. If you do unfortunately run into ticks, which I know as a shorebird biologist, fortunately run into ticks because the shorebirds bring them right to them. So again, thank you all for joining us today. We hope to see you again next week.